Hello everyone, and welcome to the first ever Canadian Spud Congress. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I am the editor of the magazine Spud Smart. I've been the editor of Spud Smart for just over a year now, and in that year, all of our lives have changed drastically. When I started, I was working every day in an office in downtown Winnipeg. However, 5 short weeks later, I started working from home after the global COVID-19 pandemic was declared. And since then, a lot has changed, including how conferences happen. The idea for this virtual conference came from last fall. It was then that we at SpudSmart began to see a lot of the regular Canadian potato industry conferences being canceled or scaled down in size. We felt there was still a need to have a conference with top-notch presentations and the opportunity to connect from coast to coast. Thus, the Canadian Spud Congress was born. We have partnered with the provincial and national potato associations to bring you this Congress. They have worked hard with me over the past few months to plan out a diverse set of presentations. On the SpudSmart side, we have worked hard to bring you 2 days full of content, networking opportunities at the Spud Shed, and business connecting at the exhibition hall. At the Spud Shed, you can click on tables where you'll be able to have video chats with friends you haven't seen in a while and also make some new ones. At the exhibition hall, you can browse through a number of booths from potato companies who can connect you with you to grow and help your farm prosper. So please make sure to attend sessions and visit the Spud Shed and exhibition hall. By doing so, you will receive points, which will give you the opportunity to win amazing prizes. And make sure to share on social media your thoughts and memorable moments from over the next 2 days with the hashtag SpudCon. I will be tweeting away myself as I listen in on these great presentations and visit with you all in the Spud Shed. I'll also be checking out the exhibition hall to make connections with companies from across the country to get story ideas for future issues of Spud Smart. The Congress isn't just brought to you by Spud Smart and the Potato Associations, though. We also have support from a number of companies. Thank you to all of our sponsors for their support. So please get comfy in the safety of your homes or offices and get ready for 2 great days of learning and connecting. If you have any questions for our presenters, please type them in the chat box. All of our presenters will be live online during the presentations to answer any questions you may have. So please ask away. These presentations wouldn't be possible without the support of our session sponsor. All sessions are sponsored by Corteva. Thank you so much for your support. Our first presentation is an overview of the current potato markets with Kevin McIsaac, Mark Klompian, Dale Latham, and Cedric Porter presenting. I will be acting as moderator for it, as each of our presenters will first do a short overview of various market conditions, and then we will have a roundtable discussion with all of them taking part in, which I will moderate. Our first presenter is Kevin McIsaac, who is the General Manager of the United Potato Growers of Canada. Kevin has been part of the potato industry for years, having run a family farm and worked for agricultural associations such as the PEI Potato Board. Thanks, Kevin, for taking the time to present today. Please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining the Canadian Spud Congress today. This is our first time we've been able to present this meeting in a virtual manner. Obviously, we would like to be visiting with you in each province across the country on a personal basis, but you know what? That's the way it is these days, and we are all doing it in this way. So I hope you'll find some of the information presented today to be useful in your farms. I'd like to thank SpudSmart for helping us along to put this program together today, and also the people who are following me today. Mark, Dale, and Cedric are often people who join us in person at our other meetings in other years. So thank you, folks, for joining today. Since we have a different audience today, I thought it might be important to just take a little look at United Potato Growers of Canada and see who we are and what we do. We were founded in 2006. We're funded by growers, by grower levies, with some support from our partners. Basically, the organization was founded to look at the principles of matching supply with demand and return some profitability back to the growers. So that means we gather some data from various sources, could be Stats Canada, could be Ag Canada, different areas, and make some recommendations, do some analysis on it, and communicate that back to the growers. Of course, many of you know if Harrison McCain, one of his favorite quotes was, "You can't manage what you can't measure." In United, we're all about doing some of that measuring. So that's a little bit about what we do. I wanted to look at the changes in our market in terms of our Canadian situation this year. Most of it, as you would guess, is related to COVID and the pandemic. Definitely, the pandemic has affected all sectors. In terms of table, people stayed at home more, cooked more, learned how to cook. And certainly consumption was very, very high at the beginning. It was almost impossible to keep store shelves full as people bought more table potatoes. French fry industry was a little more stressed at the beginning as restaurants closed, particularly quick service restaurants. We were left with drive-throughs, but that's come back over a period of time, and now we're looking at returning to pre-pandemic levels. We're still missing all those big events like sporting events and conferences and those places where you use large numbers of French fries. Chips have been increasing in demand and have continued to increase in demand throughout this whole stage of the game. We see that every day as consumers. All you have to do is stand in your grocery store and watch consumers bring home more and more bags of chips. Seed, some of our seed growers had a very difficult spring last year. They were the ones, of course, in the last link of the supply chain that were told about cuts in market volume, cuts in customer needs, and we're left with some supply at the very end. This year, I would say it looks promising to date, but again, that's something that could change as we get closer and closer to planting, and we will need to monitor that. I would say, though, that based on the current supply we have, demand will be, certainly matching supply, and it will be tight on most varieties, and perhaps a little short on some of the chip and red varieties that growers may need. So I wanted to take a look now at what supply in Canada is available from the first of this month onward to the rest of the marketing season here, and give you a little idea where we could have some shortfalls. Definitely, the first slide includes all of the potato sectors put together, be it seed, table, processing. You can see that in our 2021 holdings on February 1st, we were 7.4% below what's a 3-year average. I like to work in 3-year averages at least to take some of the highs and lows out. So we have 55.3 million hundredweight versus 59.7 million hundredweight in what we would call a normal 3-year average. So that's 4.5 million hundredweight there in the difference on the negative side. So that will have some challenges to some sectors of the industry as we look at this. Overall, there's some players in the industry that had bigger decreases. There are some that have pluses. Definitely on the East Coast, that's the area that had some of the bigger decreases related to that growing season that they had last year in terms of hot, dry weather. PEI's crop holdings, rather, are down by 15.6% to 12.9 million hundredweight. New Brunswick's down almost a third to 6.1 million hundredweight at 33% less. Quebec comes in pretty close, 0.5% less, 6.5 million hundredweight, very close to the 3-year average. Ontario's overall holdings are up 11%, and we'll see in a minute that's in both the fresh and the chip side. Manitoba's holdings are on February 1st are up 18.4% to 12.8 million hundredweight. That's a return to some level of normalcy after what they've had to experience in the last couple of years, and certainly on the way to where they need to be in terms of increases. They haven't needed to import potatoes though throughout the season to get this to the stage. Alberta down in terms of their holdings 10.2%. They had a pretty decent crop went into storage, but they've also had very rapid movement across all of their sectors. So their holdings on February 1st are down below the 3-year average. BC up 12% above their 3-year average at 621. And total Canada, as I mentioned, down 7.4. So that's for all of the categories put together. If we look specifically at the table sector, at the fresh sector, this is what the table industry had available to them on February 1st for the rest of the season. When you look at the big picture, we're pretty close. The number in the bottom, 1.8% less. So we've got 10.4 million hundredweight left to market as a fresh potato. definitely doesn't sound like a lot, but some of the players are really in the decrease in this one here. PEI is a large table stock producer, and with the weather conditions they had last year, their table supply on February 1st is down almost 26%. New Brunswick was down as well with the growing season that they had. However, when you look at these numbers, they are showing numbers of an increase of 6.5%. It's a little perhaps difficult for me to believe that the numbers will stay in the black throughout the season, because I don't see where the potato supply is there to maintain that. Also, it would need to be noted that New Brunswick did import some potatoes into their fresh holdings last fall from the province of Quebec, as they realized they were going to be short. Quebec up 2.6%, 2.9 million hundredweight, pretty close to last year's crop, actually, in the 2019-20 crop, and slightly above their 3-year average. Ontario on the fresh side up 17.3%. That's one of the higher levels of fresh potatoes that we would see in Ontario at this time. Manitoba does have one of the bigger increases of fresh potatoes on February 1st in their stores, in their warehouses rather, up 33% compared to 3-year average. A lot of that is related to the red potato supply. The red potato market has been slower this year. There's been more volume within that market move. Also, that supply does contain in Manitoba some quantity of number 2 reds, which will not make it into that top category. Alberta, a smaller player on the fresh side, but their holdings are up 21.3%. Of course, some of those potatoes in Alberta are destined for the small potato category, which is an up and coming one. British Columbia up 22.6%, a big fresh producer overall, 465. So that's where we fit in terms of Canada. Overall, not such a big difference, 1.8, but definitely some regional differences there that will have some repercussions and some situations in creating shortages for packing sheds, some movement of potatoes around throughout the supply channel. Processing is definitely the category in Canada that is down overall, down about 4 million hundredweight, 35.8 million hundredweight that's available for fryers and chippers to use from February 1st onward. That's about 10% compared to the 3-year average. Most players, with the exception of 2, are down. Ontario is up 10.5%. Ontario's industry, of course, is destined for chips overall. And we know those potatoes will be needed to meet that increase in chip demand. The other increase would be in Manitoba, up 18.2%. Of course, we know there's been an increase in expansion of their manufacturing plant in Port-au-Prairie, which has needed additional potatoes. The overall processing supply was not sufficient, even with that number, to maintain that. So far, they've been importing potatoes in Manitoba from provinces and from the U.S. as well. That has changed in recent days as the fryers are now, evaluating their frozen inventory. Going through the others, PEI's processing holdings are down 13.8%, 8.2 million, and New Brunswick's down almost 40%. So those two provinces there, that has definitely some situations for their French fry manufacturers in that province that will need to take some downtime, and have been taking some downtime to do some maintenance on their plants, to refab some of their lines, and to do some of those things, given the availability of those potatoes. Quebec is pretty close in terms of their needs for their processor in Quebec, down 0.5. Alberta, down 18.7%. Alberta's had very, very good movement in terms of their process sector since the crop was harvested. Potatoes moved out of the province into their neighboring province of Manitoba for processing there, and certainly had good domestic movement as well. So their holdings are down pretty substantially compared to what we've seen in the 3-year average. So that's the picture on processing. Finally, in terms of seed, the available seed that we have to plant and to market out of the provinces for this coming year. Seed is down 2.7% at 9 million hundredweight compared to 9.2 million hundredweight in a 3-year average year. So we are off there in total, not a a large amount, but certainly are off. The difference is that if you look at the numbers on the right for the top 4 provinces, they are all in the red. So there's decreases in PEI. PEI and New Brunswick being pretty large seed growing regions. PEI being down 3.6 and New Brunswick down 37% in terms of their availability of seed they have to ship to market. Quebec down, Ontario down, Ontario being a smaller player in seed. Manitoba's seed holdings are up 10%. That will be basically all needed to plant their upcoming crop. Alberta's holdings in terms of seed are up 16%. And that's even after Alberta's had a very, very good marketing year so far in terms of shipping, in terms of getting actual potatoes out of their storages and into the hands of customers. So that is a surprising number given the amount they've already shipped. BC's industry in terms of seed has been declining somewhat, down holdings 10.5%. So I think the point overall is that we certainly don't have any extra seed to move around with, and no extra room there to make any changes at the last minute with seed. I wanted to change gears now and just take a look at our crop and what it's done over the last few years for us. We've got a pretty good data bank here from on the left-hand side, 1986, moving upward in a gradual way towards the 2020 crop. You can see the increase has been gradual but significant in most years. We actually reached a peak in the 2017 crop at 314 hundredweight per acre. And then we had a couple of weather-related issues in the next 2 years. We went to 310 hundredweight, 309 hundredweight. Those were related to harvest conditions and also temperature conditions. So those dropped us back down below the 314. And of course, we know last year we had pretty significant yield issues with a lot of parts of the country. So that brought our overall yield in Canada last year in the last crop down to 296 hundredweight per acre. So we're looking forward to, and I think we're probably in line for some increases as we go along and get some of this stuff out of the way here. So I think growers are looking forward to improve yields as we move forward. One thing that was different in the crop last year, we had less acres that had to be abandoned due to poor weather at harvest. In 2018, we had a substantial amount of our acreage that was left out in the field, 18,000 acres, when it got just too cold. Those players in that year were PEI, Manitoba, and Alberta that had to leave substantial numbers. That number increased in the 2019 crop even more to 20,000 acres plus. The players changed a bit. It was Manitoba and Alberta who had to leave substantial amounts. And even last year, it wasn't successful for all areas. Quebec had a difficult, wet harvest season and got very cold at the end, so they had to leave a couple thousand acres there to get towards the end. So we've returned to more of a normal, but it's still not a 100% success here, and that's not something that growers have a lot of control over really on a day-to-day basis. Putting everything together in the big picture, if we look at this is a graph that shows acreage production and yield. If you look at our acreage is in the blue. If you look on the left-hand side, we started here at 2003, and IDA was formed in 2006. Previous to that year, we probably had some excess acreage there in terms of what the market really required. From that point on over to, say, about 2017, we kind of got our acreage in line, more supply in line with demand, really, and level that out. Now, as we move forward from the 2018, 2019, 20 crop, we need to see that acreage move up slightly to make room for some of this improvement and these increasing demands in our industry. Overall production on the bottom in the yellow bars has been pretty consistent when you look at the big picture, and of course that is related to the yellow line on the very top, which is yield per acres that increased. It's really taken less acres to be able to provide that same production. And as I pointed out, we'd really like to see that red line in next year move back up to a significant increase. Hopefully it will. In terms of trends, a couple in acreage last year was down at planting time as we went to the field. Planted potato crop in 2020, down 1.4%, 5,000 acres. Basically, that was related to the uncertainty in the industry at planting time due to COVID. Growers were told about cuts in their contract volume. Markets were uncertain at the time, and growers made decisions not to plant those potatoes on an open basis. So our acreage did drop last year by that amount, and had been normal circumstances, we likely would have moved up a bit further. And finally, in terms of our production last year, overall, fairly close to a 5-year average. Came in at 104.2 million hundredweight. That's 0.75% less than what we would have in our 5-year average. And again, as I pointed out, the big differences there are in the eastern provinces. Big provinces and little provinces had issues with that weather situation, bringing our overall production down. Some increase back up in terms of Manitoba. And in terms of Alberta, but not quite enough to get to where we need to be there in this year. So as we look towards the future and think about planting intentions, and we're today it may seem like we're in winter, but we're really not very far away from planting. What are the top concerns among growers? As I talk to growers, almost every grower in every category is concerned about overplanting. No matter if you're a fresh grower, or processed grower, or seed grower, most growers understand that the negative effect that it has on your profitability to plant too many potatoes and more potatoes than what the market actually requires. And I would say the second thing is a continuation of some of that market uncertainty we saw last year due to COVID. We're in the second wave now. Will that continue? Is that near done? Will we go into a third wave? And how does this affect our markets in terms of French fries, in terms of our quick service restaurants? And, our consumers actually getting tired of being at home and cooking at home, and will consumption of fresh potatoes drop off as we go along? Those are all the things that we don't have a handle on today, and I'm not sure anybody does, but we have to track this closely as we get closer to planting. The other thing is, as we learn and observe, the climate for growing potatoes seems to be changing. We've had more than one season now in the eastern part of Canada where it's been hot, dry, really lowered yield substantially. It's been hot and dry in Western Canada as well, and certainly in those areas, they also require a snowpack to be able to supply those reservoirs with water this coming year. And we see from the chart here in terms of some of the availability of moisture from the snowpack, there's a lot of areas in yellow and in brown. Not really the amount of snowfall we would like to be able to fill those reservoirs for that coming year. Those are things that we don't know what will happen in the coming year, but certainly on the minds of many growers. And the final thing I would say is, as we do get close to spring, is growers should keep one thing in mind if you can, and that's the wise old adage: plant for a known customer at a known volume at a known price. There was some areas of the industry last year that made some pretty good money unexpectedly, but I don't think we want to speculate on that, because in the end, someday we may get caught doing that with with good data to back up what we really know. So be careful, and certainly take advantage of any opportunities that are out there, and be adaptable. Be ready to change as the market changes. That's about all I have for today. I really want to thank our partners. If you have an opportunity to provide any business to them, we'd really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you as growers for joining today, and thank the other speakers of this conference as well. It's as I said, it's the best we can do given the virtual circumstances, but we hope there's been something in it for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Next up is Mark Klompian. Mark is the president and CEO of the United Potato Growers of America. Mark grew up on a seed potato farm in Montana and has spent his professional life in various roles throughout the processing industry. Thanks for being here today virtually, Mark.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Klompian. I am president and CEO of United Potato Growers of America. I'm very happy to be with you all today, and I want to thank the folks there at the Canadian Spud Congress for having me as part of the program. What I want to do today is take a look at the fresh potato market for this current crop year. And how we'll do that is take a look at the different major fresh varieties and their supply and pricing trends for the last 10 years or so, and take a look at a market outlook along with that. So to start off, we'll take a look at the yellow potato category. This first slide looks at the 10-year history of yellow potato shipments out of Canada into the U.S. as a percentage of the total U.S. yellow shipments. You can see this current year we're projecting 11.3% of the total U.S. yellow utilization will come from Canada. Last year that number was the highest it's been at a little bit over 15%. This next slide shows the actual numbers of hundredweight shipped into the U.S. with the trend line attached to it. And you can see that trend is in the definite upward direction over the last 10 years. This year we're projecting a little bit over 1 million hundredweight, almost 1.1 million hundredweight will be shipped from Canada into the U.S. That trend line is roughly almost 50,000 hundredweight a year, 46,900 sacks a year coming from Canada into the U.S. So this is what it looks like in total for total U.S. yellow potato shipments. And again, you can see that trend line, just like in Canada's case, is in that definite upward direction. In fact, year over year, we've had increases almost every year, with last year really being the only exception. Slight bobble downward, but right back to that trend, and then some in this current year. We're projecting almost 10.8 million hundredweight of yellow potatoes will be shipped in the U.S. That'll be the first time ever we will exceed 10 million hundredweight. So this is the yellow tracker. This shows how the shipments have gone year to date, and you can see that heavy red line is this year's shipments. That is against the dotted line, that's last year's shipments, and the kind of light pinkish color background, that's the 3-year average of yellow shipments in the U.S. So you can see we trended along far exceeding both last year and the 3-year average all the way up to about Thanksgiving time. And then from early December forward, we've been roughly on pace with last year and the 3-year average, give or take. So overall, we're almost at 10% ahead of last year, and we're about 6.5% of the 3-year average. Kind of summing up the yellow potato supply data, if you look at that average 10-year annual growth in yellow supplies, it's actually a plus 8% per year. That's what the trend line would be. And that's actually down slightly from when we looked at it last year because of that little downturn that we had in the 2019 crop, but still an incredibly positive number for the yellow category. And that's something that we are certainly not going to see in the red or the russet category. So it's kind of an anomaly, and that growth rate in the yellow sector has been pretty incredible. The growth rate versus last year is actually 13.1%. And with that supply increase, there's also been that demand increase to go along with it. And so because of that, let's say you use the 10 5-pound bale price as a proxy for grower return, it's still up in that $16 to $18 range right now, which is very favorable, very fair grower return in the yellow category. We've talked about this a little in the past, that really there's no single geographic region that dominates the yellow market. That's one of the differences in the yellow market between, say, reds and russets. We're in the red category. The Red River Valley and North Dakota, Minnesota certainly are the dominant player in that red market. And in the russet market, it's certainly Idaho is the dominant player. But in the yellow market, there's really no single geographic region that very far exceeds maybe 10 or 12% of the total. So the biggest players are California, mostly in Kern County, Idaho, San Luis Valley there in Colorado. Those are the 3 largest, but again, none of those is a vastly dominant player like in those other markets. And we always talk about this with the 1-year growth pause. You know, are we nearing the plateau that we've discussed in the yellow market? Certainly this year would not indicate that, because we're back on track with that trend line continuing to go in the increased direction. And so it is something that we always want to keep an eye on, where that supply and demand balance is going to intersect. We don't want to exceed that, but so far in the yellow market, we've not shown that, as the continued growth has been met by market demand that is certainly matching that. And so because of that, grower returns have continued to be very fair in that yellow supply market. Now let's shift gears to the red potato category. And just like with yellows, I first want to take a look at the 10-year history of Canadian red potato shipments into the U.S. Again, those red bars along the bottom are the percentage of Canadian imports into the U.S. of red potatoes. And the longer bars are, of course, the U.S. actual shipments. So you can see this current year, we're projecting about 12.3% is what the total of Canadian imports will be. Now compare that to last year, where it exceeded 17%. That was a much bigger number for Canada, but part of the reason for that was because it was a down year in the U.S. for red potatoes, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute here. But looking at the overall trend for Canadian red shipments into the U.S., you can see that just like in the case of yellows, that trend line has been in the upward direction. This year we're projecting about 1.36 million hundredweight will be shipped into the U.S. Again, last year was a big number, 1.7 million. But that trend line is about the same as yellows, actually, about 47,000 hundredweight. And that continues to show some growth from Canada coming into the U.S. Now looking at the total U.S. fresh red shipments in total for the last 10 years and kind of the trend on that, you can see 10 years ago we were growing, and it kind of plateaued back in the mid 2010s up in that 15.8 to 16 million range. Kind of leveled off, came down slightly, then it tailed off and pretty dramatically last year. Now there was a big significant reason for that, and that was the challenges that the Red River Valley had in their harvest window with Mother Nature. And so that dropped significantly down to just a shade over 12 million hundredweight in total last year. The Red River Valley probably lost anywhere between 35 and 40% of their fresh red crop due to the harvest disaster that they had in 2019. We've rebounded somewhat. We're back up to roughly, let's call that 12.5 million hundredweight as our projection for total shipments from the 2020 crop. So that's a bit of a rebound, but still, if you looked at a 5-year trend, that would be in the downward direction. I'll show you in a minute the 10-year trend lines on this. Showing the red tracker to date, just like we did with yellow, you can see how this has gone along, exceeding the last year's shipments, which again were quite low, relatively speaking, and they've exceeded it most of the year. Ever since about Thanksgiving time, we've been kind of on similar track as the 3-year average and last year's number. Overall, we're up 6.2% in total over last year. However, we are still down almost 8% from the 3-year average. So to sum up that red potato supply data, the average 10-year annual growth rate in red potato supplies has actually turned slightly negative. It's negative 0.9%. The major 2020 crop shifts were the Red River Valley being up a little bit, 5% roughly. Big Lake in central Minnesota there had a very big crop. They were up 30%. Colorado and Wisconsin up 18 and 20% respectively. The other major players in the red market, Idaho, Florida, Skagit Valley, and Northwest Washington State, and Texas were essentially flat to last year. The Canadian 2020 crop imports of red potatoes we expect to be down 20% from last year. But remember, that was on top of a very large number that I showed you on that Canadian slide from the 2019 crop. So we do expect that to be down. But again, the growth trend is certainly still there in the Canadian imports of red potatoes into the U.S. As far as pricing goes in the red market, we certainly see some more stability in that red pricing, i.e. less affected by supply shifts probably than ever before. Some of that we certainly attribute to the utilization of market information and the grower collaboration, a lot of that which is facilitated by United Potato Growers. The current pricing, again using that 10.5 pound bale price as a proxy, is in that roughly $13 range, probably on average of all the regions, and that's still a good price. It's still a very fair return for the red growers. So now let's shift gears again, and we'll move on to russet potatoes. Here again, we'll take a look at the 10-year history of Canadian russet potato shipments into the U.S. You can see the small red bars across the bottom as a percentage of total U.S. shipments of russet potatoes. And of course, you can see that those are, on a percentage basis, much smaller than either the red or the yellow categories. On the basis of the actual shipment numbers, you can see here that that trend, however, is still certainly in the upward direction, even for russet potatoes. And that trend is actually a little bit over 50,000 hundredweight a year. This year, we're projecting that we will, or that Canada will ship 1.7 million hundredweight into the U.S. It's down a little bit from last year, but again, last year was a very heavy fresh shipment year for exports from Canada into the U.S., over 2 million last year. Now, some of that, bear in mind, was driven by processing supply that spilled over into the fresh market. I'll talk more about that here in a minute. This takes a look at the overall U.S. fresh russet shipments on a 10-year basis. You can see that that trend line is in a downward direction. It's been somewhat stable over the last 3 years, you would say, although 3 years ago, for the first time ever, we dropped below 70 million hundredweight shipped in the U.S., went slightly above that last year, and here again this year, our projection is that we will be slightly below it again at 69.86 million hundredweight. This slide then shows the 2020 crop russet potato shipment projections. The left-hand side of the chart is the blue bars. Those are the weekly shipments, actual weekly shipments to date. The right-hand side of the chart, these orange bars, show the projected weekly shipments for russets into the market for the remainder of this crop year. The light blue background is the 5-year average, and the dotted blue line across the top is last year's shipment numbers. So you can kind of see how the trend has gone here for the first half of the year. Going forward, we are again looking at a very balanced situation, if you will. We're certainly below, in most cases, last year's numbers, and we are probably, give or take, roughly close to that 5-year average. Certainly last year was driven by this big spike here during the initial 4 to 5 weeks of the pandemic, where there was massive runs at the retail level. Then you saw the drop off in food service come, and then it kind of blipped up and down a little bit here as it went along. But again, we're looking at a very balanced situation, we believe, going forward in this year. The other lines that are on this chart are pricing lines, or return lines, I should say. That's the grower return index. That's the dashed heavy yellow line across the top. That's last year's grower return index, and the red dashed line is this year's grower return index. That is a weighted GRI number, weighted grower return index, meaning it's weighted for the returns in all of the 4 major russet shipping regions: Columbia Basin, Wisconsin, Colorado, and of course Idaho. And the way that this line trended last year, you can see, as it always does, it kind of dipped at harvest, but then Idaho had a big freeze in the early part of October. That was kind of an inflection point in last year's market, where the pricing certainly took off from there forward. It rose up into that $12 to $13 range and stabilized there really until the unofficial beginning of the pandemic in mid-March or so. And then it actually increased for 3 or 4 weeks because of the huge demand on retail, and the food service sector hadn't yet, the pipeline hadn't emptied out yet, and that demand hadn't quite been, the decimation hadn't been quite fully felt. But then certainly 4 weeks or so into it, it certainly was, and the price began to drop pretty precipitously, and the food service sector in particular dropped all the way down into that $9 range, where it kind of leveled off up until June, mid to late June time period. It actually reversed course and started increasing again. Some of that was driven by the processing sector coming back into the market, taking back some of the potatoes that they had earlier pushed back into the fresh market. And they needed those as demand started to rebound in their sector to some degree by that point in the early summer. The other thing that happened was the USDA came out with that Farmers to Family Food Box program here in the U.S., and that also helped the supply side to alleviate some of those potatoes that had been destined for the food service market, and that also probably had some of that favorable impact on that grower return. So it started off, or it ended this year where it started off this year. It started to come down through that harvest window, as I said, as it always kind of does, as all those new potato supplies come onto the market. However, unfortunately, this year we didn't see that inflection point where at the end of harvest, when the cellar doors go closed, it started to come back. Unfortunately, this year, because of the continued decimation, so to speak, in the food service sector, that pricing, especially in those states that are heavily reliant on food service, remained low, and they actually continued a little bit lower. They've stabilized somewhat here over the last 4 or 5 weeks, but again, in areas like the Columbia Basin and Idaho, where they are much more heavily weighted to the food service sector, that had a very negative impact on that grower return index so far in this year. Kind of summing up the Russet supply data, I always kind of like to take a look at the price-supply correlation. The average 5-year U.S. Russet supply is 71.5 million hundredweight a year. That's taking the last 5 years from that original chart I showed you on the Russet supply into the U.S. The average all-region weighted GRI for those same previous 5 years was $8.10 to this point in the year to date. The 2020 crops estimated fresh market production, like I showed you, is just a shade below 70 million, 69.8 million there, and the average weighted GRI for all regions for this crop to date is $9.28. So that is a better price, obviously, than that 5-year average. So what is that supply price correlation? Well, it's this. The Russet supply price correlation means that, and again, this is a very simplistic look at it, granted, but kind of gives you the sense of this market, that a 3% lower supply gives a 15% greater return from those numbers I just showed you on the last slide. This really demonstrates the inelasticity of the Russet supply side of the equation. And by that, I mean that a very small changes in supply can have a much greater impact in terms of percentage of change on the grower's return. In this example, a grower can earn more harvesting 97 acres, 3% down from 100, let's say, 97 acres at $9.28 than he would at 100 acres at that $8.10 level, significantly more. Last year, just to kind of point out that the correlation last year at this time when I gave this presentation, we were showing a 10% lower supply over that 5-year average, and that gave at that time a 63% greater return. Now this shifted, of course, because of the pandemic later on in the year, but again, it just kind of points out in very general terms the inelasticity of that market. We've always talked about it being in that 5, 6, or 7 to 1 range. This last year number would have been roughly 6 to 1. This year it's more like 5 to 1. But again, it really demonstrates that point. So with that, I will end my presentation and say thank you again to all of you for having me as part of the program today.
Great presentation, Mark. Next up is Dale Latham. Dale is the Executive Director of the Potato Growers of Washington. He has worked there for almost 3 decades and is also the president of the Potato Marketing Association of North America. And thanks for being here, Dale, and please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your 2021 Canadian Spud Congress. I certainly wish we could be doing this live, face-to-face, and interacting, but we'll have to make do here with a virtual presentation. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dale Latham. I'm the Executive Director of the Potato Growers of Washington, and I'm also the President of the Potato Marketing Association of North America. Today, I thought what we would do is talk about the frozen potato market, give you a little update on where we've been and how we got to where we're at, and then also just briefly of where I see us heading. Between the years 2015 and 2020, we saw a lot of expansion of processing capacity in North America. I'll talk more later about as to why that happened and things, but the expansions that took place was Lamb Weston building plants in 2015 in Boardman, Oregon, then again in 2017 in Richland, Washington, and then 2019 in Hermiston, Oregon. Further, then we had Cavendish Farms built a brand new state-of-the-art facility in Lethbridge, Alberta. The difference here is that they did close their existing facility in Lethbridge, which resulted in about a net increase similar to the Lamb Weston expansions. And then in February of 2020, we had an expansion by the J.R. Simplot Company in Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. In addition to those fry lines, there were a lot of chop and form lines added or expanded. Most all of the new capacity had some capability of doing chop and form, but a lot of additional older plants had it added or expanded. You total it all up, and in that short period of time, we had more than 2 billion pounds of finished product capacity come online in North America, and that is more than a 20% increase in capacity. There's some future expansions that have been announced. There's a plant currently under construction in Othello, Washington by McCain Foods, and there's been one announced by the J.R. Simplot Company, but it hasn't broken ground yet. So why did we need all of these new plants? Well, one factor is exports. Exports had always been the growth factor for our industry. For more than 20 years, domestic sales had been flat in the U.S. and in Canada as well. And the only growth that we saw was exports. And that continues to be true, that the exports continue to grow. But what's different now is, while we have very mature markets in Japan and China, and that this real growth was coming in what we consider the second five Southeast Asian countries, such as Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and they were the ones that were at rapid expansions while we had small growth in the others. Mexico and South America have also seen some pretty significant growth, while nothing like what we were seeing in Southeast Asia. Definitely has some very positive results there. But the other thing that has changed is, like I just mentioned, we've gone more than 20 years without any real increase in domestic sales. But that all changed starting there in 2015 when McDonald's introduced their all-day breakfast. And then the other chains that followed along behind them. All of a sudden, our industry really could not keep up with the demand for the frozen potato, the chop and form frozen potato products, such as the hash browns, the breakfast potatoes. It was just something that we did not foresee. And when you have a mature market like the frozen potato market is in North America, to move that needle by 2% in 1 year, that was really fascinating. But the real fascination comes in when we start talking about Taco Bell's Nacho Fry. That particular limited time offer blew every record out of the water in terms of QSR sales for these types of entries. It was so popular and exceeded everybody's expectations by so much that we had restaurants and distribution centers running out of product every day in the U.S. And it was something that I'm not sure if it's human nature, that if something is limited and you can't have it, you want it even more. But for whatever reason, that became so popular that then you had other restaurant chains starting to jump in and taking advantage of that, and starting to coming up with toppings for their fries and tots. And this whole loaded type of fry has really taken hold. And overall, I'm not sure if that changed it or just times or whatever, but all of a sudden fries were no longer being looked at as being the poster child for obesity and being bad. They had a much more favorable light given to them. Looking at North America versus the world, like I've mentioned before, even though our expansions were happening, our share of the frozen potato market worldwide continued to decline. Part of that's because the European processors expanded even faster and larger than we did. There were also some issues with exchange rates and higher costs that did not make us as price competitive in some markets as we would have liked. And then you have other countries such as China, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, and Turkey that have expanded their own domestic processing capabilities. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, the domestic increase in demand in the North America also played into that. And we just didn't have enough product, and partly too then because we had some limited raw product supplies. We had some weaker crops there for a few years in the upper Midwest and Atlantic Northeast that then, just even though we had the capacity, we didn't have the potatoes. So as I mentioned, we had those weather-related losses in the upper Midwest and the Atlantic Northeast those years. And, to fill those gaps, open potatoes were purchased in the Pacific Northwest and moved at a very, very high cost to the other plants to keep those plants running. And that also then added to the price differential that was mentioned previously. And all put it together, we were just unable to fully meet the demand that was there. But what this really did, though, was it allowed the EU to open the door to bringing more product into North America. They had always brought a tiny amount into the U.S. to serve like the cruise ship industries and things like that. But now all of a sudden, when we couldn't meet all of the demand that was there, they had an opportunity to come in and pick up some not only retail, but get their foothold into a few of the restaurant chains. And they have more than quadrupled their imports of fries into North America during a time when we were expanding. But moving ahead, looking at 2020, I think it's safe to say that that is a year that we will never, ever forget. But if we look at what was going on in 2020, it started out as, a year where both exports and domestic sales were setting new records. And the industry was beginning to wonder where in the world were all of these potatoes going to come from to meet this demand. And then in late spring, COVID hit. So COVID definitely had an impact on the potato industry. There's never a good time for a pandemic to hit, but having it hit right at the beginning of planting time is far better than if had it been in the middle of the growing season or right before harvest. When the crop was already made and everybody had their costs into it. So that was the bright part of it. And so with the uncertainty right then, processors were able to roll back contract volume before further commitments were being made. And other than a few thousand acres that had been already planted in the Columbia Basin, most growers were able to adjust. Those of us, though, that did have some acres planted, we had to decide whether we wanted to dish them out or grow the crops open. And growers chose both options, and I'm not sure which one was the better one. But, at that time, there was so much uncertainty that nobody really had a good idea of where we were going with this. About the time we finished planting in the Columbia Basin there in early May, processors were deciding that, this thing is getting even worse than what we thought, and we're not going to need all of the storage potatoes from the 2019 crop. And so growers were told that they could find any other market for about 20% of their storage potatoes to please do so. And so growers took them at their word. And I know, fortunately, up in Alberta, there was a processor in a nearby province that needed potatoes, and most all of those potatoes were purchased and shipped that way that were told that they were in excess. But down in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, we didn't have that option. And so a lot of our potatoes started going to cattle feeders and dairies at very minimal cost. And in fact, more than 1 billion pounds in Washington were given away to local food banks. So it was very much a economic hit to those storage growers. But then in a short period of time, that first wave of the pandemic seemed to wane out, and rebound in sales was occurring. And, processors reversed course. All of a sudden, they needed all the potatoes that were remaining in storage as the new forecasts were coming up that what they did end up contracting in 2020 was not going to be enough to meet their needs. And so what they were able to do then was secure all of the rest of the potatoes that remained in storage and postponed some early harvest going on there in the Pacific Northwest, and that allowed some of those yields on the 2020 crop to come up even more, and they were able to bridge the gap. Looking specifically at food service here, that has had the biggest impact from the pandemic. Sit-down restaurants, stadiums, cafeterias, etc., have all been hit greatly. Without having live sporting events and concerts, that has been a big hit. But the biggest hit for this segment has been sit-down restaurants having limited or no seating capacity, in some cases because of the pandemic shutdowns. The high labor costs that are involved in dining rooms has kept some of them closed. I know I've had a few restaurants tell me that with the uptick in electronic orders going out for delivery and takeout, that they're not sure that they really need their dining rooms anymore. When they look at the cost it takes to keep the dining room sanitized to meet COVID requirements, it's simply something that may not be in their business model much longer. And even though they have had opportunities, a lot of restaurants have not been able to adapt. And so far in the U.S., we've had over 110,000 restaurants that have permanently closed. According to the National Restaurant Association, that is more than 12% of all restaurants that were operating prior to the pandemic. So while fries are still North America's favorite side dish, and we're on more than 80% of the menus, being on that menu doesn't mean a whole lot if that restaurant is closed. Taking a quick look at consumer demand, consumer demand has definitely varied. Retail sales of frozen potato products jumped more than 30% as consumers switched to more meals at home early in the pandemic. QSR sales dipped slightly, but then went to higher than pre-pandemic levels quickly. Drive-through delivery and takeout became the go-to means for getting a meal away from home, as there were fewer restaurant options for consumers. And then in the beginning, fried food was viewed as safer by many Americans. That was kind of surprising to me, but that came back in multiple surveys. So if we were to sum up 2020, retail sales are up more than 20% for the year. Food service is down more than 30%. QSRs are up. And that's big news for us because this is our biggest category by far. Breakfast servings continue to grow. Drive-through delivery and takeout orders continue to climb. And operators who adjusted quickly to meet the new challenges have seen more than double-digit percentage increase in sales. That has really been phenomenal for us. And as this pent-up demand continues to build, the future is going to be, if this thing opens up, how will we keep up with all that pent-up demand? Challenges that lay ahead continue to be that we have new hurdles in export markets. The world's view of how the U.S. has handled the pandemic is giving us some pretty great headwind. Many parts of the world are expressing fears of importing U.S. food products, including fries. We have some port slowdowns again on the west coast of the U.S. It's not labor-related this year. It's simply that because of trade interruptions, ships are being loaded and unloaded slower, and fewer containers then are available for returning frozen potato products to those markets. We have still some issues with tariffs. Not a lot of them, but there's still a few of those that exist out there that are causing a few issues. And while the U.S. has had those headwinds, Canada has been able to pick up some of the volume. But because you have far less capacity and port availability, it has prevented you from doing even more. Looking domestically, when we start forecasting out the next 18 months, there's more questions than answers. Will the vaccine be successful? If so, then how quickly will the economy open back up? When will consumers have more options? And when they do, will QSRs continue to have strong sales? Will we have enough of the right cuts of fries and packaging for when sit-down restaurants open back up? This was a major issue when retail sales took off. We had to retool some plants to change their cuts and also their packaging. And then just overall, how quickly will food service bounce back when consumers, start getting vaccinated? Will they feel confident and safe to go eat out as often as they did before? Lots of questions. Touching briefly on contract negotiations. It's safe to say that the negotiations are off to a tough start in the Pacific Northwest. While both the growers and the processors admit that the other side has been impacted by the pandemic, it's very, very difficult to get either side to see where each is coming from. Processors have been having a difficult time passing along finished product price increases, and grower costs are going up, and that's without even including the sunk costs that they had in the 2020 crop that they didn't get back. Many growers had to pay for the seed that didn't plant, had acres rented at very high rates for potatoes in the Pacific Northwest that had to go to other crops that they were not able to recoup the added costs there. Also some fumigated ground, a lot of things that went on. But, at this point in time when I'm recording this, the major processor that has an offer on the table in the Columbia Basin is seeking a 4% reduction in price. This is something that's going to be very difficult to overcome, and I don't know where things will end up, but all I can tell you is right now we're trying different approaches, and it's looking like it's going to be a very, very tough year. So I'm approaching the end of my time. I want to thank you. I look forward to future interactions with you, and possibly in the future coming in presenting in person to you rather than virtually here. But if you did need to reach out to me or wanted to, you see my contact information there. And I just, again, want to say thank you for allowing me to be part of the Spud Congress, and wish you great success with the rest of your show. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. And last, before our roundtable discussion, is Cedric Porter. He's coming to us all the way from the United Kingdom. Cedric is the editor of World Potato Markets, a weekly briefing on potatoes and potato product trade, prices, and production.
Hi, and greetings from the UK. I'm Cedric Porter. I'm the editor of World Potato Markets. World Potato Markets is a weekly briefing on potato production, trade, and pricing, and we have lots of loyal readers in Canada, so hi to you. So let's start with some good news. We certainly need some good news, and I think the good news for us in the potato world is that there has never been so many potatoes in the world, and people are eating more potatoes than ever. So if we look at the potato production figures, these are based on the UN figures with some of our own estimates for 2020. So you can see in 2019, the latest figures, production was over 370 million. And we think in 2020, it'll approach 380 million. We've seen yields of potatoes increase by around about 40% on average in the last 30 years. So potato growers getting better at what they do, fewer of them, but actually growing more potatoes and each one, and actually growing it on a smaller area. So a professionalized industry as people growing more and more potatoes. And as well as growing more potatoes, thankfully, people are eating more potatoes. And we've certainly seen that in this last year with the pandemic and at home. And it's not just table potato consumption that's been going up. It has also been frozen fries and products. And we've seen consumption of increasing by more than 10% in a lot of key markets, including the US, UK, France, Germany, and elsewhere as well. So that's really a good news story for us. But that has to be tempered with the continued closure of restaurants across the world. Here in Europe, I'm based in the UK. All our restaurants are closed and going to be closed for the next few weeks at least. And that's similar across Europe. And I know also similar in other parts of North America as well. But Canada has certainly performed well if we look from a trade perspective. These are frozen fried exports in tons on a monthly basis. You see that black line there, that's 2020 figures. The orange one is 2019. And you can see there was a dip in April, May, and slight dip in June, but then a return to demand in July and onwards. And actually most of the months in the last part of the year, Canada was exporting more than the corresponding year before, and so very little change in the overall tonnage of exports from Canada. So good news there for you. We look at America, we go south and look at America, that actually we see a different picture in terms of exports. Exports declined rapidly from April onwards and really have not recovered even through into December. Slight recovery there, almost back to pre-pandemic levels, but not quite. And overall, a 17% reduction in consumption there. There we also see in frozen fry trade that has been the surplus there. The US has been imports more than 200,000 tons more than it exported in 2020. There, if we look back over the other side of the Atlantic, we see that EU fry sales are recovering. We see those exports again a decline in March and April and May, June, as the pandemic really took hold. And then, but from July, August onwards, we see a recovery, and we're now back to very similar levels. So more or less the same amount of volume exported. These are exports outside the EU, so not European markets, so not Dutch to Belgium or Belgium to Cyprus type exports. So that's we've seen that recovery there, and that looks as though it's recovering through as we go into 2021 as well. Very important for you as competitors, EU fry exports to the US have increased as well quite considerably, and really that had started before the pandemic in the second half of 2019, and a lot of that demand has been maintained through that time. So very much a competitor there for Canadian fries going to the US market. You've got those EU ones going there as well. A lot of talk about EU fries going into different markets and in terms of pricing as well. So if we look at some of the pricing of the three main players, if you like, the EU. So again, this is EU exports outside the EU rather than inter EU trade. And we see there Canada, US as well. What we see is EU prices being consistently below North American and Canadian and American prices. Canada there nestling between the EU and the US. These are all in Canadian dollars per tonne. There is some evidence of a slight widening of that gap with EU prices coming down a little bit, but that's only a little bit. It's not a great big decline in price since the pandemic. If we then look at on field and on farm potato prices in the EU, we see that they're still rising. They were very depressed back at the end of 2020, and these are actually the futures market on the German futures market. And these are for April futures, April 2021 futures there in that blue line, comparing it to previous years. And you can see, so there has been a recovery, certainly really since Christmas, and that price is now over 100 euros a tonne. Whereas at the beginning of the year, the physical price of potatoes was only about 20 euros a tonne. So growers expecting higher prices. This is going to influence on how much they grow in the EU this year. These are calculations based on figures from Potato Group in Belgium, France, Germany, and Netherlands, and these are our calculations as well in the blue figures there. Growers were earlier in the season encouraged to cut their plantings for 2021 by 15%. I think that's probably an overcut now, and it's probably going to be more like 5% cut in area, and that would take us back to around about the 5-year average. There of about half a million hectares of potatoes grown in those 4 countries, and depending on yields, then that would sort of give us an average crop. If we had a 15% drop in plantings, and then there was poor yields as well, then I think we would be seeing a very, very small, obviously seeing a very, very small crop and a completely different market, particularly if there had been a recovery, or there is a recovery in food service demand around the world and throughout Europe. Then you can see that there would be a massive deficit of European potatoes, and probably then the prices on farm, but also some of the export prices would be going up as well. So that's our sort of take on that. So I think, yeah, the headline there really probably a 5 to 10% reduction in plantings, and rather than the 15%. So this in 2020, growers did plant less processing potatoes, but they increased their table potato production as the pandemic started to take hold, and it became clear that people wanted to eat more potatoes at home. They did increase that production a bit. So actually the processing potato figure is down a bit. Just one slide on Brexit, and so Brexit has finally happened after nearly 5 years since the vote. Real Brexit, if you like to call it, on January the 1st of this year, when the ending of a transition period, when the UK was still in a single market with the EU, that ended at the end of 2020. And now what we've got is what's often called a Canada-style arrangement. So goods can travel freely between the two previously. That goods that now have to undergo customs and food and plant health checks, but there are no tariffs. So that free trade, that real free trade that used to be with the EU, that is now finished. Potato products, not really too many problems there. There have been some more serious problems in terms of meat and seafood and more perishable goods. And British seed potatoes cannot be exported to the EU because of misalignment of phytosanitary rules. And that actually includes, perversely, includes Northern Ireland. So Scottish or English or Welsh seed cannot go from there to Northern Ireland, or because it has closer links with the EU because of its land border with the Republic of Ireland. So it all gets very, very complicated, and of course complexity adds cost. And so we are seeing a reduced trade. Obviously British seed producers, they're very upset that their potatoes, around about 20,000 tonnes of their, or more, 30,000 tonnes of their potatoes go to the EU every year. So they won't be planting those this year. There might be then some opportunities then, I suppose, for Canadian seed suppliers. If all of the phytosanitary rules are in line there. The UK has signed an initial trade deal with Canada, replicating what it had with the EU, and both countries want to expand that. The UK has also applied for CPTP membership, the Pacific Trading Bloc, even though it's as far as from the Pacific as you can really get. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Just really much sort of me finishing off. This is a question really for the whole of the global potato industry. How can we make more of the spud love that we've seen in the last year, of people falling in love with the potatoes for the first time, or rekindling of their love for potatoes? And there's plenty of good stories around there, not just the nutritional and the good value, but also the climate change stories and all the alternative uses you can use for potatoes as well. So I think really as an industry, it's how do we look at that, and how can we build on that love? One thing that we've been doing in lockdown is our Planet Potato podcast. Looking and celebrating the potato. So not really on how to grow them or how to sell them, but just all the weird and wonderful things about potatoes. So features on Mr. Potato Head, visit to a potato hotel in Germany, and there's a potato having its lockdown haircut. That was the Potato Photographer of the Year competition. That was the winner of that. So do have a look at our website for there. The links. Any questions you have for me, then please get in touch. And there's also the links to our website and also the podcast again there. So please get in touch. I look forward to to seeing you and hopefully being able to visit the US Potato Expo and perhaps Canada next year in 2022. You're also most welcome in 2022, hopefully, to come over to the World Potato Congress taking place in Dublin in May and June 2022. And so all it leaves me to do is to wish you a happy Spud season, and for you to wishing you and your families can keep safe in these very difficult times. Many thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys, so much for your presentation. Lots happening in the potato markets right now. It's been quite the year, to say the least. And now we're just going to have a bit of roundtable discussion. I really appreciate you guys all being here. First off, of course, you guys all touched on this in your presentation, but I don't think we can just ignore it now that we're talking in this group. Of course, the one thing that's been on top of mind in all of our lives last year has been the pandemic. So I know you guys are looking at this growing season, but of course, the pandemic isn't just going to go away. It's going to have lasting impact. So how do you guys think the pandemic is going to affect potato markets in the next few years? Maybe I'll start with you there, Mark.
Sure, Ashley. Thank you very much for having me and as part of the conference there for the Canadian Spud Conference. Yeah, it's certainly going to continue to have an impact. It had a huge impact, as you know, over the last 12 months, 11 months now, I guess, the unofficial start back in mid-March, I guess. So the biggest impact in the fresh potato markets here in the U.S. and I'm sure around the world, but certainly has been in the food service sector. It also had an impact in a positive way, I guess you'd say, in the retail sector, but the largest negative impact was, of course, in the food service sector. And we expect that, your question about going forward, we expect that to continue for a while yet. The thinking is that, certainly the food service sector is going to come back, but it's going to take some time. Reports I've seen, say anywhere from 2 to 3 years before it gets fully back to what you'd call the quote normal, I guess. But that impact is felt in specifically in states that are more heavily weighted towards food service sector, like the Columbia Basin, where Dale is, and in Idaho. Other major fresh shipping areas like the Red River Valley or Colorado or Wisconsin are more reliant on retail, so that's actually been okay for them because the retail sector, as you know, has been about 9 to 10% higher than it was before the pandemic in terms of volume. So, but anyway, to your question, yeah, we do expect that impact to continue in the food service sector for a while yet. And it'll start to come back, but it'll be a process and probably a little bit slow to get there.
Thank you. Cedric, of course, you kind of did a lead in there. Anything you want to say?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ashley, and thanks very much for inviting me. And so I'm beaming in from the other side of the Atlantic, and very similar in lots of ways. The way that the market has been good and bad, I suppose, hit in terms of reduced food service. So lots of restaurants in Europe are still closed, locked down, and probably will be until at least the sort of beginning of maybe right through until the end of April, certainly for sit down inside. There is talk about some being allowed to open outside service. There's still takeaways and still deliveries taking place. But on the flip side, you have seen an increase in potato consumption at home, more than 10% in a lot of cases in most markets across Europe. And I think we're seeing that across the world as well. So markets, you see a very strong market in India and places like that, where people have been growing, well, they need to secure their own food supplies and have been wanting to grow more potatoes and buy more potatoes as they see it as a good, versatile and good value food to feed them and their families. So yeah, and I think this is going to sort of work out in the next few years. I mean, if you look at recessions, the big recessions, 2008, it took a couple of years really to get back to normal levels of people going to restaurants really across the world. And I think, that's probably going to happen again. I mean, this one's different because restaurants have had to close. People Some people might have more money because they've been able to save money, but there's a lot of people who have been affected. But I think one of the strong points for restaurants with potatoes is, it's its versatility and its value within the food service sector. So, if you're running a food service restaurant or whatever, having your bag of fries, having your potatoes, they're good staple menus, staples. And if you are going to be running your restaurant, you're going to want to have those on your menu and in your store cupboard and in your freezer. So, I think there are some positives in the next year or two as well.
Thank you. Kevin, anything to add for here in Canada there?
Yes. So in Canada, and thank you, Ashley, for having this panel. In Canada, I would say probably we're a little less reliant on some of the food service sectors in the fresh side of the business. More of our fresh potatoes go into the retail end, which have been perhaps just a little bit less affected than some. But we have had some effect certainly on the processing industry in terms of what potatoes go into French fries. We're not quite back to where we would like to be in pre-pandemic, but we're getting closer. And definitely on the chip side, we see increased demand, and we see maintenance of that demand as it goes forward. So our industry has been probably positive as a result of some of this happenings in the pandemic versus some of the other competing vegetables and fruit crops that we would see in this time.
Dale, do you have anything to add?
Well, the only thing that I would like to add, since thank you, Ashley, for having me, would be that since I represent the frozen processing sector, everything that Mark, Cedric, and Kevin have said so far is absolutely true. And, we're being impacted on the food service side as well. But the bright light for us is that the biggest part of our segment goes to quick serve restaurants. And the bigger name ones of those are doing extremely well with their drive-through and increases in carry out and home delivery. And so as a segment, we have not been impacted nearly as much as the fresh has. And so while it's been, an impact, there's no doubt about that. But because of that, and then like as Mark was alluding to, the uptick in retail, that impacted the frozen processing side as well. And so we have two positives, but one big negative. And so overall, though, the impact has been lesser on us. But we expect that as things rebound, that will come back quicker a little bit for us, because we have how strong it has been in the quick serve restaurant segment. And so we're very optimistic that within the next year, we're going to be seeing things back at least to the 2019 level, and probably even a little bit above that.
Thank you. And another big story the last few months, and I guess maybe even the last year really, around the world, and not just here in North America or in the US, has been the change in administration down in the US, with Biden winning against Trump and coming into office last month. So, of course, the US affects everywhere in the world, and especially here in Canada. So I guess just what I want to ask is, with a new American president in office, what should Canadian growers keep in mind? And I think I'll start with Mark, because I know, of course, you do a lot of work back and forth with national stuff. So I think he has some interesting insights to say about what's been going on there in the US for Canadian growers to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I don't know if I'm qualified to comment too much on the politics of things, but I'll give this a shot. Yeah, certainly with the new administration, a few things will be different in the regulatory environment we anticipate. So certainly the U.S. industry is going to be, tuned into that and watchful of things that impact the potato industry. One thing I'll mention on the political side of things, it was a USDA program, but it was under the Trump administration, the USDA started what's called the Farmers to Family Food Box program. And that was at the beginning of the pandemic to really try to help move some of those potatoes that were previously destined for the food service sector that had no home. And that was a pretty big deal for our industry to help move some of those potatoes. I don't know if it had a major impact on price. We think it probably did a little bit in a favorable way, but moving that volume, getting it to people in need was a really good thing. So one of the things going forward that we're going to be advocating for to some extent is some kind of continuation of that program, whether it's takes a different shape or form, that remains to be seen. But we think it's been very beneficial. Just before the change in administrations, the 5th round of that Farmers to Family Food Box program got underway, and that's runs through the end of March. But again, we're going to be advocating for, in some way, shape, or form, that to continue to help alleviate some of those areas where potatoes are long because of the food service sector impact. And so that is one thing on the political spectrum we will be looking for.
Thank you. And of course, our other American on this table, Dale, do you have anything to add that Canadian growers should be keeping in mind right now?
Well, not really, other than the fact that the frozen processing sector is pretty heavily reliant upon exports. And so, we will be watching about what happens with tariffs and trade agreements and those types of things. Right now, I don't know enough to say that it's going to be positive or negative, but that's definitely something that we will be keeping our eye on. But domestically, I don't see the whole lot that's going to impact us other than what Mark was mentioning with regulatory things on the growing side. And so we'll be monitoring it very closely, but I don't know of anything at this time that I'm overly optimistic about or alarmed about.
Understandable. It's still so new. And of course, we just talked about the pandemic. So there's still a lot more things that have been top of mind for the Biden presidency. And Kevin, up here in Canada, what have you been keeping track of since we've seen this change in administration for Canadian growers?
Thanks, Ashley. Well, one of the advantages of having a United Potato Growers of Canada organization is that we have consistent communication with our counterparts like Mark at United Potato Growers of America. Growers point out it's nice to have an open communication forum where we can discuss things like trade issues back and forth. So I'm positive looking forward. In the past, we've actually had Sonny Perdue, who was the Secretary of Ag in the U.S., visit our chairman's farm in Prince Edward Island and to see how potatoes are being grown. So we've had a decent relationship in the past. And some days we're envious in Canada of that food box program, that the volume of product that was able to move and put into the hands of needy consumers. But overall, I think we look forward to continued good relationships back and forth. Certainly, I would say the approach looks a little different now than it did in the past, but I think the overall intent is the same. One little change that we did notice, in previous years, we used to export more product into Mexico, particularly in terms of frozen products. We certainly see less of that now as the U.S. side is able to do more of that with their relationship with Mexico. And I guess finally, I would say, the processing companies in Canada are also processing companies in the United States. They have factories on each side of the border, and depending on the economic level of the currency and the economic atmosphere of the world, they can shift production from side to side. So it's important to have a good open relationship between both.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as I said before, this affects the whole world. So across the pond there, Cedric, what are you guys keeping in mind in Europe and when you're looking at the global perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously, I think everyone's been very interested, politically and even personally interested in what's been happening in America. And I suppose now, I think everyone's sort of taking it as a bit of a breathe. Let's have a little bit of calm and see how this is going to develop, and some of the noise and has gone away and died away. Of course, for us, one of the big political things. I'm based in the UK, so one of the big political things has been Brexit and the UK leaving the European Union, and that I think there is going to be a different dynamic there between trade between the US and Canada and the UK. UK has done a deal with Canada that's very similar to the EU, and it's looking at doing another, developing that deal over this year. The talks between the UK and the US on its own sort of trade deal. I think there's been more moves to have a US EU trade deal, or to certainly sort of look at different aspects and have more talks on EU and US trade. So perhaps there will be a little bit more sort of coming together in terms of trade deals there. And one of the issues that really has sort of come up with the UK is been about sort of food standards, and so the UK wanting to insist on having similar food standards in a trade deal. So there is some room for some friction there. I think there's probably more alignment with the way potatoes are produced than perhaps some other crops between Europe and UK and US. So that's not some of the issues. There's certainly issues on poultry and things like that. But I think just generally, people are going to be sort of taking some time to see how the new administration is going to look. I think there's going to be quite a lot on climate change as well. That's going to be an issue that quite a lot of people are going to be looking to be working on together in terms of that. And in the UK, we've got the big COP26 climate change conference coming up in November, hopefully face to face. And I think, there's probably a little bit more alignment between where the UK, EU, and US are looking on climate change now. And that's challenges for the farming and the food industry, but also I think there are some opportunities there. Certainly for the potato sector as well, in terms of its very good green and climate change footprint, if you like. And that's probably some ground there that the potato industries across the Atlantic and Pacific can work on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much there, Cedric. You actually stole my next question. I was going to ask about Brexit. So I guess I'll throw it out to the rest of the group. What have, of course, that's been something that's been going on for way longer than the pandemic or the US presidency. It's been news for years now. So now with it actually happening, what have you guys been keeping in mind though, and looking at your respective markets? Maybe let's first off start with Kevin to get the Canadian side of what we're seeing from the Brexit finally happening.
Sure. Well, to be quite honest, we probably pay less attention and not deservingly so to the European situation than we do to the US. But for the products that we do export, we do have some seed exports that are into the European areas. Definitely watching how that is affecting the industry, because we know there's been some changes in the seed volume in terms of what's allowed to be shipped as seed there. So we're watching that a little bit. We also have, of course, some interest in the processed products that come out of Europe, and whether that will increase into Canada as exports into our country. We're watching that as well. But overall, we're taking a wait and see attitude, I would think, in terms of how this will roll along.
Dale, do you have anything to add on the American outlook when you guys have been, when we've all been watching Brexit the last few years?
Well, for us, the European Union is our number one competitor worldwide when it comes to exports of frozen potato products. And they make a very good product there, and they've been very aggressive on pricing for years. And we're not sure if it's because of the COVID, Brexit, or what, but they've become even more aggressive on pricing, as well as trying to get into new markets, including the US. That's a real concern to us, is that they keep increasing every year their number of volume of frozen potato products that come in, to the US on the eastern seaboard there. They're also into some other markets that we've been in, coming in hard. And so, again, we're not sure if it's because of the supply situation created because of COVID, or if it's Brexit related. but we're monitoring their actions very closely. They're a very big concern to us.
Yeah, I've been seeing some news myself when I'm following the potato markets about that European product coming into North America. Cedric, do you have anything to add for why we're seeing that product coming into North America?
Yeah, I mean, we have been seeing it for quite a long time. It's been increasing, but it's certainly increased more in the last year or so. I think there probably is a COVID element to that. There's certainly been a reduction in markets in the EU. So countries like Belgium and Holland, Netherlands, biggest producers of or exporters of rice, well, in the world, but certainly in Europe. And they have been looking for other markets, and going into the US has been one of the areas there. I suppose that, I think there was a surprise that how strong the demand was in the US after March last year, and after the harvest of last year. So there has been. I mean, there's some evidence that prices is a little bit lower than it was before. But it depends on which side you are. Which, if you can argue if that's prices being, the Europeans being very competitive and driving down the prices to try and win market, or just as sort of a symptom of the market, if you like. But yeah, so they have got excess fries to sell. And they are looking at markets around. So other markets, quite big sales into the Middle East from Europe, and has been in South America as well, Australia, and also into some of the Asian markets as well. They've been so actually sales outside the EU have been slightly stronger in the last year than sales within the EU. So I mean that will continue for the rest of this season. It may change a little bit in next season, but we might want to speak about that a bit later.
Thanks. Mark, do you want to add anything on this kind of Brexit and European product talk we're having right now?
Yeah, not really much to add, Ashley. Cedric does a great job of summing that up. He did that for us for our United Potato Business Summit earlier in January. And to Kevin's point, that's really where we get, for the potato industry anyway, in North America, a lot of the news on the impact of Brexit on worldwide potato markets. So we very much appreciate that. It's really about that, like was said, about that trade landscape that we're keeping an eye on, and from Europe and the UK back and forth now. It's a lot of that has to do with frozen, but certainly, as you know, the potato industry is very symbiotic. So what happens in the frozen sector does have an impact on what happens in the fresh sector, and vice versa. So from that standpoint, those dynamics are important to us in the fresh sector as well. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, is keeping an eye on those trade impacts.
Actually, could I just add, in terms of seed, there is a Brexit issue with potato seed. The UK can't export at the moment, hasn't got the certification to export seed into the EU. That's left them, well, our growers will grow less seed potatoes to accommodate that. It's very strange that actually Scottish, English and Welsh growers of seed can't even export to Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. It all gets very, very complicated in terms of EU, United Kingdom, whatever. But it looks as though there might be a reciprocal thing with the UK banning imports of seed into the EU. So that might be something particularly for the Canadians to be looking at. There might be some opportunities there to be looking at UK and perhaps EU market there for seed.
That is really interesting. I think I may have to talk to you more about that in the future, because I definitely feel that's something that is important to the growers. And I guess we're just about to wrap up, but I have one final question. Of course, just kind of polite, as we've been seeing the USDA reports and the specific Sanders reports come out, that we're seeing
reduced volume of potato stocks. So for growers, what should they be keeping in mind as we're going through the next few months, heading into planting and then harvest and stuff, and when they're dealing with their buyers and stuff, as we're trying to make sure that those stocks last? What should growers be keeping in mind? Kevin, do you have anything to say on that?
Sure. Well, we keep this track pretty closely, obviously, every month in terms of where our stocks are, and our stocks are down pretty significantly on the 1st of February, as I talk about in my presentation there. And certainly, out of all of the categories of potatoes, processing has the biggest drop right now for this time of year. And we see what's happening in the past is that processing plants have taken some downtime. They've done some refitting to their factories, and they've made other arrangements to get by with fewer potatoes in some parts of the country. So that's been some of the changes there, but definitely will be a shorter season, and also have imported some processing potatoes into the country as well, although not as many as last year. In terms of the fresh side, as I point out in my presentation, it's not a big change overall in Canada from where we would be in other years, but definitely it's a regional effect. The eastern part of the country was severely affected by drought, so there are bigger players in terms of the fresh industry in the east part of Canada. So very big deficits in terms of the table potatoes that are available. Provinces like New Brunswick have imported some potatoes into their province last fall. PEI not so much so there will be some shorter run times. And definitely the other one that we're all watching and advising growers to keep an eye on is seed. Seed is down 3% from last year in terms of the holdings, but it's going to be tight, particularly for some varieties, chip varieties or red varieties. So that's kind of just in a nutshell where we look at this time of year compared to other years.
Thank you. Dale, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, for frozen processed growers throughout North America, the wisest words I can give you is to not try to outguess your processor. There's so much uncertainty in the world, and every processing company has a different business plan and a different outlook. And if your processor says they need X volume from you, don't try to outguess that and think that, well, I'll go with Y because I'm sure they're going to need it, or vice versa. The risk is so great right now because unless your crystal ball is way better than mine, we better go with what they say, because otherwise, it could, there's just so much in this world that's happening that this would be the worst time ever to take that risk. And so you might as well just take the money and go to Las Vegas and put it on red on the roulette wheel, because there's really no other way to look at it than it's just a huge gamble if you try to outguess the processing companies.
Well, maybe not for us Canadians with the travel restrictions. Maybe we should go to Niagara Falls. Thank you.
Wherever the nearest casino is, yes.
Exactly. Got to keep that in mind. Travel restrictions, everyone. Be safe. Mark, Cedric, do you guys have anything to add?
Actually, maybe I'll just echo what Dale said. The same is true in the fresh sector. We certainly encourage our growers to pay attention to the data, the strategic look at data that our organizations put out. It's very important, and like Dale said, not to try to outguess the markets, and also for growers to keep in mind that yields continue to go up just across the board. That's been happening since the 1950s, and the trend line for yields continues to go up. So planting the same amount of acres year after year, you're going to have more potatoes. So paying attention to those stocks on hand, like you suggested, and like Dale said, to not try to outguess the markets. That's certainly what we encourage of our growers, and to pay attention to that data and look forward strategically in that light.
Cedric, anything?
I think, yeah. From the European perspective, actually, I think things are going to be tighter this year. I mean, in the four main EU countries of Belgium, Netherlands, France, and Germany, growers are encouraged to cut their production by around about 15%. I don't think they're going to do it as much as that. Prices have come back up a bit, so I don't think the cuts are going to be that great. But I think let's see at least a 5% reduction in plantings, and perhaps between 5 and 10%. So there are going to be fewer potatoes this side of the Atlantic, and obviously that will sort of tighten the export market, if you like, as well. So that might be, it might be a tighter global market, and there's sort of opportunities there for Canadian and North American processors and growers there. So I think. And we do have some pretty, I suppose, in some ways, a bit more like Canada than the US, much more variable growing conditions. So, if we have either a drought or a wet year, then the yields can be hit as well. So if you've got a 5 to 10% reduction in area and then a yield hit as well, then you can be going from quite a surplus market at the moment to real deficit within, after the harvest in 2021.
Thank you. And thanks, guys, for all your insights. I learned a lot. I hope the growers did too. You guys are all so knowledgeable. And I really want to thank you for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedules and your Zoom meetings and everything else that's going on in the world right now. Thank you so much for being here. So that's all the time we have for today. And thanks everyone for tuning in for the first session of the Canadian Spud Congress. We're now going to take a short break for you to get up and stretch your legs. And please remember to check out the Spud Shed and Exhibition Hall. They'll be open during this break. So make sure to stop by and get some visiting and business in. And then be back here at 1 p.m. Central Time for 2 hours of amazing presentations to finish off the first day.